Right, good afternoon and welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Environment and Energy. This afternoon, we are taking up H-126. And we are here with our legislative council to review proposed changes in its draft number 3.1. Welcome, legislative council.
Thank you. Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. Yes, we're looking at draft 3.1 of the strike all amendment to H-126. It's dated yesterday's date, February 27th. On Friday, I was here and you discussed changes to this draft. The changes are in yellow. And I think I'm going to start, but I'm going to read through all of the findings because one of the things that you discussed, so there are two new findings in the last draft, and one of the things you discussed was where in the list they should occur. And so we don't have to, but the chair had proposed moving them towards the end of the findings, as opposed to where they were in the last draft. So I didn't know if reading through all the findings would help that process.
Yeah, so in thinking about adding the two new findings and then reviewing the way the findings already kind of flowed together, it seemed to me to make more sense to add them at the end. And so when Ellen reviews them all, we can all ponder that as we consider it.
All right, so on page 1, section 2, findings. The General Assembly finds nature is facing a catastrophic loss of biodiversity, both globally and locally. In addition to its intrinsic value, biodiversity is essential to human survival. According to the United Nations, 1 million species of plants and animal are threatened with extinction. Human activity has altered almost 75% of the Earth's surface, squeezing wildlife and nature into ever smaller natural areas of the planet. To page 2. The health of ecosystems in which humans and all other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever, affecting the very foundations of economies, livelihood, food security, health, and the quality of life worldwide. And the causes of the drivers of climate change, the causes of the drivers of change in nature rank as follows: changes in land and seas, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. So I'll pause there quickly. I will say this draft was edited again last night, and the editors previously sub D was one sentence, and they've broken it into a list because there was a vertical list as opposed to an in-text list. All right, so then number 4 on page 2, line 11. In the last draft, number 4 was the new finding. And so the highlighting on line 11 is just to indicate that this is back to the original finding number 4, and the other finding has been moved to the end. So the 2017 Vermont Forest Action Plan found that fragmentation and parcelization represents major threats to forest health and productivity and exacerbate the impacts of climate change. The 2021 Vermont Climate Assessment highlights an increase in extreme weather events such as droughts and floods as a significant impact of climate change in Vermont, and recommends nature-based solutions as a proven low-cost strategy for climate adaptation and resilience. The initial Vermont Climate Action Plan calls for investing in strategic conservation to increase the pace of permanent conservation towards 30 by 30 targets, with Vermont conservation design guiding prioritization of efforts. On to page 3. The Nature Conservancy has developed the Resilient and Connected Landscapes Project and found that Vermont plays a key role in the conservation of biodiversity regionally. The Staying Connected initiative is an international partnership of public and private organizations. Its goal is to maintain, enhance, and restore landscape connectivity for wide-ranging mammals across the northern Appalachian Acadian region, from the Adirondack Mountains to the Maritime provinces. The Staying Connected initiative has identified 9 linkages across this vast region that are extremely important to wildlife. Six of these linkages lie within Vermont. The Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, working within the Agency of Natural Resources and with Vermont conservation organizations, has developed Vermont Conservation Design, a framework to sustain the state's ecologically functional landscape into the future. So this is a small change in the prior draft. The phrase was
It's a vision.
a vision to sustain the states, and this is changed it to a framework to sustain.
And I recommended that change because we created a vision. We added a vision in the bill, so I thought this was more accurate.
Intact and connected ecosystems support Vermont's biodiversity, reduce flood risks, mitigate drought, and sequester and store carbon. Vermont's most effective and efficient contribution to conserving biological diversity and maintaining a landscape resilient to climate change is to conserve an intact and connected landscape. In order to maintain ecological functions in intact and connected ecosystems, a full range of conservation approaches is needed, including supporting private landowner education, technical assistance and programs, conservation easements that promote sustainable forest management, and conservation easements and fee acquisitions focused on passive management. The Vermont Housing Finance Agency's 2020 Housing Needs Assessment projected an urgent pre-pandemic need for new housing. In order to meet this need for Vermonters while maintaining ecological function, funding for building these new units must be prioritized using smart growth principles. So a couple of small changes in this paragraph to reflect the discussion you had on Friday. And then finally, the land and waters, forests and farms, and ecosystems and natural communities in Vermont are the traditional and unceded home of the Abenaki people. Access to land and land-based enterprises has excluded Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, Vermonters, and others from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities in the centuries of European settlement. Efforts to increase the rate of conservation and restore ecological function and connectivity must also include opportunities to increase access to land and land-based enterprise for Indigenous people and all who come from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities. So there was some changes in this finding to break it into 3 separate sentences. Okay, so that is the finding section. All right.
You have a question? Yeah, Representative Morris.
I do. There was some conversation about reducing the length of the now 3 sentences for number 4.
Yeah, and we actually did take almost a whole sentence out.
Yeah, it kind of repeats itself there. So, opportunities to increase access to, I'm at the bottom, line 15, include opportunities to increase access to land-based enterprises, et cetera. It's kind of listed up above. Where 11, access to land and land-based enterprises. We're saying has excluded Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. And this one is saying efforts to increase the rate, I guess. So it's 2 separate ideas, but it's kind of like repeating. And we didn't have a conversation about shortening
I mean, it could say efforts to increase the rate of conservation and restore ecological function and connectivity must address, but these, but do we hear back from the Land Access Board?
They don't meet until tomorrow.
I mean, or today, Monday afternoon.
Oh, the board was, but the policy advisory work group or whatever it's called legislative advocacy work group meets today. So those are the folks that actually work on the language. But no, I have not been contacted.
Representative Smith.
I'd like to, on page 1, line 12,
Page 1.
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay.
can we start going over this, or would you rather I waited?
We'll just, we can go over that, but I want to, Representative Morris had a question that we were into right here.
All right, fine.
So,
I'll wait.
I mean, Christie, or Representative Morris, sorry, I feel like I hear your point, but I also think that it's probably worth repeating. Representative Sibilia.
I don't think we're repeating. I think they're saying two different things. But maybe to shorten it, we could just make it a 15 finding. Right into.
Yeah, I don't think we're repeating either. I think we can, are you okay leaving it? Representative Morris. Okay. Representative Stebbins.
In a way, the first sentence of 14, so lines 9 through 11 are its own thing. So if it felt long, it could be land and waters, forests and farms, that's finding number 14. And then the next finding could start with access. If that makes any difference in terms of length.
Doesn't, because it, I mean, it shortens one, but it's, I mean, I don't know. I think, yes.
I could also see, I like Representative Stebbins' suggestion, and I could also see the final sentence efforts could go in the plan section that addresses equity as well, because this is really less of a finding and more of a suggestion about how things should be.
Which I think it already is in the plan.
Right. I just mean this particular sentence because it was the way that it was phrased. I mean, or you could just make it a more declarative sentence. Yeah, actually, no, I could see that sentence being moved to the part of the plan that already references this thinking.
Representative Smith.
I would like to add to that.
It's a beautiful day.
This bill has been designed to create 30 for 30 and 50 for 50. Lines 9 through 17 have nothing to do with this bill. I don't see what connection us preserving land in the state has anything to do with Indigenous people or the BIPOC community. It involves every single Vermonter, whether you're black, white, or whatever part of a community you belong to. I don't see any need for this to be in the bill. I'm more concerned about conserving land, just like everyone on this committee is. And that's more important than lines 9 through 17 to me.
Representative Sibilia.
To go with Representative Logan's suggestion that putting some of this into the plan, I think that might make some sense. I don't think that it is exactly in the plan. I think we've noted in the plan need to include representatives from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities. Yes, I guess it does.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Recommendation to increase equitable access to protected and conserved lands and land-based universities.
Increase access. So that's the piece that I think is not access to land and
Equitable access. Top of page 10. Line 1. Well, that's the one that came up.
I've got it right here.
That's the problem. Well,
And shall include recommendations. Okay, yes. Concur. Gotcha.
heard that it's already there.
Yes.
And so
So.
Yeah.
So I don't.
Representative Logan.
What line and page are you?
Page 10, line 1. Recommendations to increase equitable access to protected and conserved lands and land-based.
I should have more there, but it doesn't need to be.
Send it.
Thank you. I think without being able to consult with the folks who provided the language, it may just not be specific enough. That one sentence, page 10. Since the finding specifically uses the term, terms for Indigenous people and all who come from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities. And I recall Trey saying something along the lines that was the language that was most, that specific language, really important.
Well, I would just say
Registering that.
this did come from Trey, this language. In the
Oh, I
plan.
know, but I think this would take this section out of the finding. So it wouldn't be apples to apples.
That's Smith.
Could someone explain to me the recommendation to increase equitable access? Who needs to have equitable access? Don't we all have the same accessibility to all the lands we want? Or do we not? I don't know.
We do to public lands. So, Representative Torrey.
This is about access to the land, nature, being stable. Is that right? Which is different from what the finding is talking about.
So who doesn't have access to being a stakeholder in this?
I think this recognizes that people have different access, that to be accessible might require different strategies and accommodations. I believe that's.
Someone help me.
Yeah, just briefly, it is making an acknowledgement that historically there has been inequitable access to land, that certain people within our communities have been excluded from land ownership. And so when we're talking about a massive transition of land into conservation and those who have been historically excluded from land ownership.
Is there inequities today? No.
Yes, but that's a very long conversation.
Okay.
Happy to provide
Okay. Thank you.
facts
Okay.
for you.
Okay, so for right now, let's focus on the finding and whether or not we need to make edits to it. Representative Stebbins.
One idea is to cut the sentence efforts to increase, so lines 14 to 17. And if, according to what Rep. Logan had said, if the language that was highlighted as being critical is
14.
for Indigenous people and all who come from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities. So tail end of line 16. Line 17 on page 11, page 4. You could add that to the top of page 10 at the tail end. Maybe that could thread the needle. So, basically the top of page 10, the tail end of line 2, you would add for Indigenous people and all.
Others thoughts? What do you think, Representative Morris?
Yeah, I was just looking at number 14 on page 4. The first 2 sentences are kind of like a finding, and then the third sentence is an action. So I think I'm following the conversation that we would move that to the plan section on page 10. If it's not already there or needs to be expanded, I'm okay with that.
Others? Representative Sibilia.
So I'm fine leaving it as it is, and I'm fine, and I'm not sure, I hear you, I hear you talking about the problem. I'm not sure what the problem is that we're trying to solve, actually. But if shortening, I'm fine with leaving it as is. Representative Morris's suggestion, I think I heard, was to take all of the second part in its totality and stick it into the plan. I would be fine with that. I think I'm not in favor of editing out any of the words in the finding at this point. Moving them around in different places.
So you're saying leave it the way it is, but
Yeah.
possibly add these words to the end.
Leave it the way it is,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
possibly add those words to the end.
Oh, move them.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Either is fine with me.
I don't see,
think.
I'm not sure I follow the problem we're trying to solve exactly either.
Yeah.
So, others, what is everyone thinking on this?
It's a finding.
It's a finding.
I would just leave it. I think it is shorter. It does read better. It is longer than the others. I do acknowledge that. But it's a finding.
And I'll say up above where it says must be prioritized, line 7, I think I had a similar reaction of like, is that an action or a finding? But it is a finding. You could say should be prioritized. But then we would probably find ourselves talking about it in 14. Representative Tory, then Smith.
I was just gonna say, a finding could be more like, and it hasn't been prioritized. Or that it's been adequate. That's the current state.
That's true.
Another possibility, if you want to keep it in the findings.
Taking actions.
Building. What did you say?
Then
And we're not addressing housing funding in this bill. So that is a interesting conundrum. To Representative Smith.
Thank you. I'd like to see some prioritization directed at some of the areas of the state that are way behind in this goal that this bill is trying to achieve. And we've talked about it before. The Northeast Kingdom is 43% right now. Chittenden County is 8%.
Right.
I think we're all set in the kingdom as far as doing our due diligence, I guess is the word I want to use. Somewhere in this bill, it would be nice if it could be directed to other parts of the state that are pretty slack, actually, for better words. And I don't mean to confuse things. I apologize if I am.
Well, by using Vermont conservation design as the frame, I think we are de facto targeting those areas that are underrepresented. That's what's happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, members. It's only
Moving
Tuesday
on.
afternoon.
Moving on.
What have we decided? What's the pleasure of the group? Leave it the way it is. Does anyone opposed to leaving it the way it is? Finding 14.
Yeah.
Christine?
Half.
Okay, that's a half to 10 and a half. We're gonna move on.
Okay. So on page 5, section 3 starts, and the first section within section 3 is the definition section. Number 1 is highlighted on line 6 to indicate that the order of the definitions has been restored. They're no longer alphabetical, but in the sort of logical organization.
Yeah, that's gonna be,
And the text of them has not changed.
Hopefully there was an expression of thanks for their effort. No thanks.
mhm.
So on page 6, there are a couple of changes. So first, line 6, the title of 2802 has been changed to Conservation Vision and Goals. So in subsection A, the vision, the sentence now reads, the vision of the state of Vermont is to maintain an ecologically functional landscape that sustains biodiversity, maintains landscape connectivity, promotes climate resilience, supports working farms and forests, provides opportunities for recreation and appreciation of the natural world, and supports the historic settlement patterns of compact villages surrounded by rural lands and natural areas. So, and natural areas has been added.
Representative Sibilia.
Natural, we don't define natural areas, do we?
No.
Is there a definition in statute for natural areas? Trick question, sorry.
So no, there is something I believe called a designated natural area, which is something that the commissioner from Forest Parks and Rec can do. It's one of the like a wildlife management area, I believe. It's one of the categories associated with that, but this is not defined.
So, and natural areas does not mean a designated natural area.
No.
Means areas that are primarily functioning naturally in a general sense. Go ahead.
And so subsection B has been rephrased to capture the intent. So it is the goal of the state that 30% of Vermont's total land area shall be conserved by 2030. 50% of the state's total land area shall be conserved by 2050.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Over the years that I've seen introductions like this, bills like this, the word shall and may have a lot to do with how this bill gets put together. Now, keeping shall in this, does this mean that what's going to happen when we get to 2030 and 29% has been achieved? Shall is going to be a bad word. If we put may in there, it's a goal to reach. It's not a guarantee. Shall is a guarantee and may is a hopeful shot at it.
Yeah,
And I think it's a great hopeful shot to be 30% preserved. But what happens when shall doesn't succeed, if it doesn't succeed?
So the lead into the sentence, it does refer to this being a goal. There is no independent enforcement mechanism under this section. So there isn't any way to enforce this if the goal isn't met.
What difference would shall or may be in this?
So you are correct that typically when we're drafting things, we use either shall or may. Shall is a requirement, may is permissive. It is being combined here, though, with the phrase goal, which is not generally how we structure sentences. And we talked about this last week in that goals are aspirational and don't have a legal enforcement mechanism. And so this committee has gone back and forth between the phrases goal and shall. And so this version is actually combining them. I haven't really seen a statute that has done that before. I don't necessarily think there's a conflict, but it strikes me that it is a stronger goal. But as I sort of have previously pointed out, there's no enforcement mechanism attached to this.
And thank you. On line 16, the land conserved shall include shall include state, federal, municipal, and private land. So how is the state gonna make private land part of this deal?
It will count towards the overall calculation.
This private land will be a voluntary shall, correct?
Yes, the calculation shall include all of these types of land.
The inventory would include private lands with permanent conservation easements.
This doesn't mean that the state's gonna go to private landowner and say, guess what? You're going into 30/30.
It does not at all mean that.
Okay,
No.
thank you.
Moving on.
Okay. On page 7, another piece of language that you discussed multiple times. I'll start at the bottom of page 6. In order to support an ecologically functional and connected landscape with sustainable production of natural resources and recreational opportunities, the approximate percentages of each type of conservation category shall be guided by the principles of conservation science and the conservation targets within Vermont Conservation Design, prioritizing ecological reserve areas to protect highest priority natural communities and maintain or restore old forests. And so the phrase ecological reserve area is highlighted because this is a change from the prior draft, which included a specific percentage.
Okay, moving on.
Okay, so the next page is on, the next change is on page 10. It's in the section on the conservation plan. On page 10, subsection C, in developing the plan, the secretary with assistance with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board shall hold 12 or more public meetings on the plan between July 1, 2023 and December 31st, 2025 to solicit input from stakeholders. Stakeholders shall include the list, which hasn't changed. So private owners of forest land and agricultural land, land trusts, conservation organizations, environmental organizations, working land enterprises, outdoor recreation groups and businesses, Indigenous groups, and representatives from historically more marginalized and disadvantaged communities, municipalities, regional planning commissions, conservation commissions, and relevant state and federal agencies. At least 3 of the meetings shall be designed to solicit comments from the general public.
All right, not seeing any questions or comments.
And then finally, in the appropriation section, there's a small change based on the conversation from last week. So $75,000 is being appropriated, $75,000, yep. And then on page 11, the funds shall be available for use for 2 years and shall support equitable engagement with community members from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities, including costs for travel vouchers, food, and childcare where necessary to accommodate participation, as well as compensation for community members who might be asked to serve on more formal subcommittees or who otherwise would not be able to participate.
Right, questions, Representative Stackwitz?
This sum would be available for public education and outreach in general. We're specifically calling out these marginalized and disadvantaged communities to make sure that they are included.
Education.
Or I just want to make sure, because when Ellen was first reading this, I was sort of wondering whether the sum is going just to those communities or not. I guess is my question.
Yes, so the first sentence that I didn't actually read is directing that the funds be used to support public education and outreach as part of the conservation plan. And then I think the second sentence adds additional detail to that, but potentially we could rephrase that if you'd like.
I see all of them. Representative Smith and then Pat.
Thank you. You just tell me the name of a town or, who is a disadvantaged community? Who is historically marginalized? What town is historically marginalized and what town is a disadvantaged community in Vermont? And in whose opinion?
So I don't think it's necessarily town specific. This committee last year did a lot of work on the environmental justice mapping tool, and that bill identified specific populations, including minority populations that have been disadvantaged. And so this is not, these terms as being used here are vague and are not specific. And so without additional detail, it would be up to the Secretary of ANR and the VHCB to determine who would fall into those categories for these purposes.
So part of this bill that we're considering passage on is vague. Parts of it.
Yes, I think multiple parts of it potentially are vague. But it's asking the VHCB and the Secretary to look at these things. And also some of the language that we were discussing in that finding, number 14, does reference some of the communities that we're talking about, but it's not necessarily town specific.
Right, thank you.
It's both, I think the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities have historically been marginalized, but also in the conversations around environmental justice and actually in the current news in Ohio. I mean, you see communities that are poor being, kind of the most vulnerable and the least welcome to the table, if you will.
Mhm.
So when I read this, I see like one of the things that came up with the climate action plan was a lot of people were included in that planning process, but some were paid to be there and some weren't, which made it a lot easier for you to participate. And the intention here is that there'll be paid folks engaged in this conversation, but there may be people who don't have it as their job to be there, who also need to be there. So the money would be available to include them.
Okay.
Should they, in particular, so that would be if they were on the stakeholder, but then it's also available for the community meetings so that a broader spectrum of the community is able to attend. Maybe both parents in a family with young children could come instead of just one, for example. That's what it's for.
All right, thank you.
Mhm. Representative Pat, thanks for your patience.
Thanks. I agree with the concern that this could be read that the funds shall be used exclusively for equitable engagement with community members from historical, marginalized, disadvantaged communities, et cetera. And I don't think that's the intent. So I'm suggesting something like in the beginning, the sum of 75,000 is appropriated from the general fund to support public education and outreach to inform the development, et cetera. Next sentence, the funds shall be available for 2 years and their use shall include support for, et cetera. So that we wanted to include that, but we don't mean that it should be only used for that.
Yeah,
And
Representative
you could even add the word also include to make very clear that you're talking about, if there's the first sentence, which is really what we're talking about, but then we're using some of that to also make sure that people engage.
So I heard you say inserting after and their use shall also include
Yeah, also
support.
include that.
Does anyone have a concern with that change, Representative Logan?
I do. The funds are to be used for equitable engagement with community members. Trey from the HCB said that this is what they anticipate the cost would be to support equitable community engagement. for 12 meetings over the course of 2 years, and said that he would be preparing and would be able to provide the Committee on Appropriations with a budget.
And there is also an including already at the end of this sentence, including costs for travel. It's very descriptive, vouchers, food, childcare where necessary to accommodate participation, as well as compensation for community members who might be asked to serve on more formal subcommittees and who would otherwise not be able to participate. So I think it's covering what I expected it to cover. Representative
So just to be
Bongers.
clear then, because it's worth clarifying if we can. I think what Representative Logan is saying, that much of the first sentence should be struck then. Because I think what you're saying is that in fiscal year 2024 to support equitable engagement, straight to that, and not to support the public education and outreach per se, because right now it's saying two things, and it's not clear. It's giving the secretary a lot of discretion, which I'm fine with, by the way, and how to make this work. But I would read this in its current form as saying the primary purpose of the money is to support public education and outreach to inform development of the statewide conservation plan. And Representative Logan is saying that that's actually not right, that the focus of the money is actually for, I don't know which it is.
Representative Logan or Tori.
I was just gonna say one insertion that might help, if you want to keep that first sentence, is just to add to support at line 20, expanded public education. So acknowledging that this is above and beyond the typical. But because really, I think that this money would be used to do all of this, that it would succeed in getting the broader participation that's needed, but probably just in terms of implementation, like the advertising, whatever, is already going to be covered. You know what I'm saying? It's not like, unless you're saying that VHCB already will have a separate sum for outreach, and this is extra. Because to me, it seems like expanded outreach covers the ground, including the target. It's supplemental that's needed to do a really good job. Doesn't mean that you're not covering the whole kind of engagement. Maybe we have to clarify this, right?
I feel like
Yes, yeah, that title. Just kidding. So on page 11, where the word engagement with is highlighted, because in the prior draft it said outreach. And so I was under the impression that the first sentence is the broad statement. The second sentence is is a more specific statement that is encompassed by the first sentence, and that we are talking about the same work.
I think we are.
Yeah.
I think we are.
So
We're getting into the weeds here on things that we've got resolution from.
so if you wanted to add that clarifying suggestion, I think you could. I would shy away from the word also, though, because that seems to cause a distinction to me. But if you wanted to add the phrase, and there you shall include support, I think you could.
I don't know that it adds anything. Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I understand the conversation that's going on. I guess I feel like we put this in response to a request from VHCD, who did a budget breakdown, specifically like 12 meetings, potentially this many people. I maybe I'm being too cavalier, but I feel like this is good enough. Like it's going to go to the entity that said, I know what we need this for.
Yeah.
I'm just finding that I don't know how to help clarify, because I'm kind of like, but
Just so far.
Although I have to say, that's encouraging us to move on, but I'm a little stuck on page 4 with the line 7. These units must be prioritized using smart growth principles. And our bill is not addressing that at all. And I just am struggling with that one.
Well, that one seems worth talking about.
Number 13.
I'm talking about number 13. In order to meet this need for Vermonters while maintaining ecological function, funding for building these new units must be prioritized using smart growth principles. We are not directing funding for housing in this bill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a concept, I think what it's trying to say is that we don't want sprawl. And I realize that that's somewhat different than what we're talking about. But we want smart, we want the housing to be built in village centers and therefore not out in farms.
I would say it's strategic investments in conservation support our goal of development in our village centers.
No, that's what we're trying to say.
That is
So
what we're trying to say.
say.
Representative Sibilia and then Smith.
So on line 7, we take out funding for and add in F for building. It would say, in order to meet this need for Vermonters while maintaining ecological function, building of these units must be prioritized using smart growth principles.
Representative Smith and Logan.
Reverend Mongart's made a point, what we're trying to say. Why don't we just say it?
Yeah.
That's what
Well, it's Representative Sibilia's proposed finding. So we want to make sure that she concurs with that before we spend time on that.
Yeah, I think that there's, Madam Chair?
Yes. Yes.
I think there's some concern. There's that urgent need for housing. And I think there's some concern that this bill does not acknowledge that or might be an impediment to that. And in fact, this bill could help inform and accelerate where we want to build housing and where we don't. So it could be helpful in that regard. So it would acknowledge the urgent need for housing and point to where it should go.
So I said the word strategic investments in conservation, and you said could inform and accelerate investments in housing.
Inform placement.
Form
Yeah, where?
and accelerate placement. Well, Representative Logan.
Just trying to puzzle through that language to make it sound more like a finding too, but it seems like what you're trying to say is that conservation planning of this kind is beneficial to citing providing a framework for citing housing in a way that also enables us to maintain ecological function.
official to citing housing.
In a way that makes it
Needed housing.
possible for us to maintain ecological function.
System.
Did someone have their hand up over here? You just pointed at something. Oh, I have, well, I have strategic investments in conservation, inform and accelerate. And a citing of housing or development of new housing. We could just say in our downtowns and villages. Mm-hmm.
Is that not what the SMART goal principles are?
Yeah. They are.
We don't want to have to define that, right?
You don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Strategic investments. Representative Tory.
Could we just say, in order to meet this need, the Vermonters will maintain an ecological function? Updated inventory. To guide. So it takes it back to what this was about, which is about the need for a baseline and a need for at a time when there's a lot of development pressure that sets the stage.
Another suggestion.
Yeah.
What about that second sentence being something like, oh, now I'm gonna lose it, I just had it. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, come. I need another minute. I think this is
Representative Smith.
Don't town plans address most of this?
Yes. Well, what do you mean most of this?
Well, our town plan in Derby addresses development, housing and sprawl
Yes.
and keeping forests and that sort of thing. Don't most town plans, isn't that part of a town plan where they have to address this?
Representative Stebbins.
Technically, yes, although we heard testimony, like 6 weeks ago that showed us a chart of like how and where sprawl was occurring. And it was because of older structures within how we thought about town planning. So I guess I'd say Representative Smith, technically, yes, but it's not necessarily working the way I think people think it needs to work today. It's based off of the testimony we heard 4 or 5 weeks ago.
You have the vision now, which supports historic settlement patterns of compact villages surrounded by rural lands and natural areas. Representative
You
Bongartz.
could get rid of the existing second sentence as it is and say instead something like strategic investment in ecological conservation, or even just conservation. In conservation is consistent with construction or development of housing in town centers, or even that language that you just read to mirror.
Consistent. I like what you just said. Did you write it down?
Yeah.
Say it again.
So we've replaced the second sentence with strategic investment in either ecological conservation or conservation.
Just conservation.
Okay,
Yeah.
conservation. It's consistent with construction of housing in Vermont's villages and town centers. Basic.
I think it's worth trying on.
Sounds good to me.
Can you send it to me or read it again? You can, yeah, you can read it again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Strategic investment
And conservation
in conservation
is consistent
with construction of housing in Vermont's villages and town centers. Historic villages and town centers. Villages and town
Yeah,
centers.
villages.
Villages and town centers.
All right.
strategic investment in conservation is consistent.
Consistent with.
Is consistent with construction of housing in Vermont's villages and town centers. Okay.
Okay.
So I think This is the only change you're requesting.
So far,
Okay.
Sibilia hasn't
So
said that.
are villages and town centers excluding places that would be included in smart growth?
Smart growth really is within villages and town centers. It's about like having sidewalks and some of the other.
So should, I mean, like,
Smart growth takes place in village centers
not downtowns.
and downtowns and village centers.
So downtowns is
It's
not
within.
listed. Town
What
centers
was the
is
term?
listed.
I think
Oh,
town
I see.
center encompasses
Does it?
all different
That's
types
what
of
I'm asking.
downtowns and new town centers and
Okay.
growth areas.
Right. That's what I was asking.
To me, it's encompassing.
There, the words that are used in the sentence are not the defined terms for designated areas. So I think they would encompass any.
Representative Bongartz.
I have been, I keep going back to this 14.
Okay, hold on. Are we finished
Oh,
with
okay, I'm
13?
sorry.
Larry, Representative Sakowitz.
Yeah, no, I have remembered what I said, but I'm happy for us to go along.
Okay. Great.
The progress.
And we have Michael O'Grady waiting in the Zoom room, but go ahead.
But the third sentence in 14 is, it's not quite internally consistent. Efforts to increase the rate of conservation and restore ecological function and connectivity must also include opportunities. Well, they don't. Because we are talking about, when we're talking about that, we're talking about ecological function, which doesn't include opportunities for, anything to happen at least in some instances. I think what we're really trying to say here is efforts to conserve land must also include. So I think we're making that one overly complicated. It's sort of, it's inconsistent.
Efforts to increase the rate of. Otherwise,
I would simply say efforts to increase conservation must also include opportunities to increase access to land. And that's, I think that's as a policy. I think we'd all be for that. But when we're talking about ecological function, we're talking about ecological function, which really doesn't have anything to do
oh, I
with
see. Efforts to
us.
increase land conservation must also include.
Yeah, that's what we're really trying to say. So I just cross out because I can't make that jive.
Might be part of what we were stumbling over. Representative Sibilia.
So I am hearing that, and now I have a question mark. Because I think we're saying we should take out land-based enterprise, which is.
No.
I'm saying it's the part about the rate of conservation and ecological function. I'm simply saying, I think we just make this simpler and say efforts to increase conservation.
Yeah.
Must also include opportunities to increase access to land and land-based enterprises.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try that one on too. Got it?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Thank you. Are you available later today after we finish up with Michael O'Grady?
I am currently being called into Senate Appropriations. So I do not know when. They have booked me for an hour to do S5.
Okay, for what hour? I may.
It started at 2.
Okay.
So they do usually finish up
Probably.
between 3 and 4 at some point. So, but yes, I can potentially come back, but and this shouldn't take me long, but I will be in a committee, so I won't be able to draft.
So just let us know
Okay.
when it's done and you're available and we'll figure it out.
So maybe around 3:30 or thereafter?
Yeah, we have Michael from 2 to 4
Oh, you do? Oh, okay. Then that would be,
and we're going to take a short break before we start with him.
okay.
Thank you, Ellen.
Great, thanks.
So members and Michael, let us break till 2:15